In this video, we're going to implement Optimistic UI in Next.js 14 using the new useOptimistic hook in React, which I think is the last piece of the puzzle when it comes to working with server actions in the app router. Now, if you're not comfortable with what server actions are, I do have a bunch of videos on the channel where I explain what they are and how you can use them inside the app router. Just search for server actions or actions on my channel and you would see a bunch of videos there. But from a high level, server actions are functions that you define on the server and you can execute them from client components or server components. And they basically remove the need to have a middle API layer to perform tasks on your server side. So you just define these functions and call them from anywhere inside your application. Now, we have introduced two new hooks in previous videos. They use form state and use form status, which is to hook into the state of your action, whether or not it's completed or pending, to implement error handling and pending state. So I'm going to link to all of these videos down in the description and also in the cart. And today we're going to use the useOptimistic hook to implement an optimistic UI. Now, let's first understand what optimistic UI is and what problem it is trying to solve. Then we're going to jump into the documentation and see the details of how we're going to go about implementing them. Now, in short, optimistic UI is when you optimistically update the UI while an action or a network request, for example, or any asynchronous task is still pending. So for example, in this simple to-do app that we have, this is actually an app that we created in previous videos for server actions, and we're going to build on top of this. Now, what I had done in this app is that, let me just open up the console. So on the network tab, I have throttled the network to be fast 3G, so it's a smaller network. Maybe even let's go to slow 3G to exaggerate this. Now, I'm going to create a new task, but even though I'm on a slower network, you're going to see the task immediately popping into the UI. So we're being optimistic that this request is going to go through. So we're going to update the UI first while this request is still processing. And then we're going to wait until the request comes back. And if it fails at any point, we're going to revert back to the previous UI that we had. So let's just add something else. Let's say learn optimistic UI and enter. You see down here, it automatically popped. But if you looked at the console, this request is still processing. It took it about 2 seconds to process while we immediately see this task added to our list. So this is the problem we are trying to solve, or this is what optimistic UI means. So let's go to the documentation from Next.js first. If you search for server actions, you're going to land on this page, and on that page you're going to see this section where it talks about optimistic updates. Now it says that you can use the useOptimistic hook to optimistically update the UI before the server action finishes rather than waiting for the response. So how you're going to use this is use optimistic hook. Actually, let's go to the React documentation to see this in more details in React, and then we're going to come back to Next.js. So from a high level, as a reference, again, this is a React hook that lets you show a different state while an async action or task is on their way. So you can pass some state to it, and this is going to return a copy of that state that can be different during the duration of the asynchronous action, such as a network request. You provide a function that takes in the current state and the input from the action or the new state. And then this is going to return the optimistic state that you can use inside of your UI while the action is pending. The state is called optimistic because it usually is used to immediately present the user with the result of performing an action while that action is still taking time to complete. So you're going to call useOptimistic hook. You have to pass state to it and a reducer function that takes in a current state and the optimistic value and returns the new state that you can use inside your UI. This is going to give you that optimistic state back, as well as a dispatch function that you can call and pass this new value to it. And there's explanation here on what each of these parameters or the return values of this hook is. But basically, you pass this, your current state, you pass a reducer function, and you get the optimistic state back. So this is similar to the Next.js implementation, where in this instance, they are rendering some messages and the user can submit a new message. They're showing the optimistic messages down here as they're coming back from this hook instead of the messages themselves. So messages, the state is going to be that state passed to useOptimistic hook. We have this reducer function, which is an array of messages and a new message, which is going to just be appended at the end of our current state. And this becomes our optimistic messages or the new state. And this is the dispatcher function where we would just call this, for example, here, we have this action defined in line inside of our form. It takes the form data, extracts the message out of it, calls the add optimistic message to update the UI, and then calls the server action behind the scene to actually perform that mutation on the server. So let's come to our application, and I'm going to walk you through what I have built so far, and then we're going to implement the useOptimistic hook to update our UI instantly, even while the action is still pending. Now we're going to build on top of this simple to-do app that we have created in previous videos working with server actions. And I'm going to walk you through exactly what we have done there if you haven't watched those videos, or to just orient yourself with what we're doing here. And then we're going to add the optimistic UI on top of it. But before I actually dive into the project, now that we don't have any optimistic or useOptimistic hook, I just want to show how this under a throttle network actually behave without having the optimistic UI. So right now, I'm going to add a new task while still having my network tab or throttle onto slow 3G. So I'm going to say learn server actions. I'm going to hit enter. And you see, I don't see this down here. This is not going to show up until the request is processed and I get a response back for React or Next.js to update the UI. So I just wanted to contrast the two so you get a better understanding of what we're trying to do. Now, with that out of the way, let's just turn this back into no throttle, and then let's look at our application and see what we're working with. So inside of our app router, we have this page. Inside of our page, layout hasn't changed much other than me adding this toaster component, which is from Sonar or ShatCN. By the way, this is a Next.js app that works with Tailwind CSS, TypeScript, and ShatCN. I do have a video on the channel where I walk through my Next.js implementation, and there's actually a GitHub repository as a template that you can just copy and clone. I'm going to include that in the cart or in the description if you wanted to get started with a brand new Next.js app. But here we have this toaster function, which is just going to allow us to show a toast notification to the user anytime these actions actually encounter an error. Other than this, everything else is just the same as what you get out of running the script. So let's go inside of our page. Inside of our page, I have this to-dos component, and I'm passing in some to-dos prop to it. So let's see what is happening here. So I'm calling this get to-dos function inside of my homepage. This is a React server component, so I can go ahead and fetch the data directly inside of my server component to get some to-dos back. Before diving into this to-dos component, let's actually quickly look at this get to-dos function. I have defined some functions to talk to my database. Here inside of this lib folder, you see this to-dos. I'm just collecting all of these functions or organizing all of these functions inside of this lib folder. I'm using Prisma to talk to my MongoDB database. So the get to-dos function is going to access the Prisma client, access the to-do collection on my Prisma client, and call the find many to get many to-dos or all of my to-dos. And I'm returning those to-dos back to whoever is calling this function, or returning an error if I encounter an error. Now inside of the lib, you can also see this Prisma. This is where I'm creating a client. Pretty standard for creating a Prisma client when you're working with Prisma. Now, when working with Prisma and MongoDB or installing or initializing Prisma, you're going to have this schema.prisma as well. This is where I'm defining that I'm working with a MongoDB database. I have the database URL inside of my environment variables. So I have included this env.example. This is where you would post in your own connection string to MongoDB. If you're not familiar with working with MongoDB in your Next.js apps, I do have a video on the channel. That video doesn't work with Prisma, but it's just setting up MongoDB in Next.js. Now, going back to our Prisma schema, let me just show you one more time here. I have defined this to-do, which is representing my to-dos collection in MongoDB. And each document inside of this to-do is going to have an ID, a title, is completed, which is a Boolean, created at, and updated at. So as we're creating these new tasks, they're going to have these properties. Going back to our page again, we're calling this getTodos function, fetching the to-dos from our database and passing them into this to-dos component. So let's go to this to-dos component and see what we're doing. Please ignore the parts that I have commented out. This is the useOptimistic hook that we're going to add momentarily. But from where we left off in the previous videos, or just implementing this functionality using server actions, what we're doing here from a high level, that we have a form. This form has an input type text, that's that form up top. And I have this submit button, which I pulled into its separate component because I'm using the use form status. This is the pattern that you need to use because the use form status can only hook into the to the form state of the parent. So this cannot live at the same level as our form. Again, there is a video on the channel which I talk about these two specific hooks, use form status and use form state. So do watch that video if you want to know how to control the state of your action and the pending state of your form. So that's that form. And then down here, I have this list element, which I get the to-dos that I received as a prop up here. I map over them. And for each one, I'm rendering this to-do item. Now, to-do item is just implementing this checkbox. We can actually cross them over to mark them as completed. And we're going to have optimistic UI for that section as well. I haven't shown that, but it's just the same idea. We're going to dive into that after we complete this. But for now, let's just leave the to-do item and come back and see what we're doing once this form is submitted. So I've defined an action. This is a client-side action because I'm not defining any use server directive inside of this function. Now you can have client-side actions or server-side actions. Now here I'm defining a client-side action because I'm calling this server action, which is create to-do action. We're going to look at in a second, but I want to, for example, reset my form. I want to show an error. So I want a client-side action or a client-side function where I can control this stuff about the error handling or resetting my form, and then also calling my server action. So from up top, this action is going to receive the form data from React. This part is handled by React. So I'm going to get the title out of the data that was submitted. This is a form data type, and that title is correlating with this name that I have given to this input. So whatever name you give it, you can just get that value. I'm checking to see if title exists. If it doesn't, I'm returning. And if it does exist, well, I'm going to reset the form and call the create to do action, which is a server action, pass the title to it, and await a response. If there is any error, I'm going to use that toast notification that I just showed in the beginning to show an error message. Now let's dive into this create to do action. So inside of my app directory, from here, I have this actions file where I have defined all of my actions. This is a common pattern where you would just write this use server directive up top, and this is going to tell Next.js that every single function here in this file is going to be a server action. So I have defined two server actions here. Let's just start with the create to do. We're going to dive into the update to do, where we go to the to do item component, which is this individual tasks. Now in this create to do action, we receive the title, and we're going to call the create to do function, which is from our lib folder from our to-dos. This is our database access functions to create a new to-do. Let me just quickly dive into this. So we looked at the get to-dos when we were fetching all the to-dos. I have another function here that's for creating a to-do. It's accessing the Prisma client and the to-do collection to create a new to-do, passing in this title, and the rest is going to be implemented automatically by Prisma. So going back to our action, we're calling the create to-do. We obviously have wrapped all of this inside of a try catch. If we encounter any error, we want to return this error object with an error message on it. And finally, we're going to revalidate our path, which in case of success is going to revalidate the index route and refetches the to-dos to get this new to-do that we just added down in the bottom of the list. And in case we encounter an error, this is going to, after we implemented the optimistic UI, if we encountered an error, by revalidating the path, we're going to refetch to-dos from our database. And because we encountered an error, the new to-do is not going to be in the database. So revalidating the path, it just returns the UI back to the state that it was before we optimistically updated it. So this is what we have so far. Let's go back inside of our to-dos component and see how we would go about using the useOptimistic UI. So let me comment all of these things back in and see what we have done here. So I have imported the useOptimistic hook. We have to pass a state to it. This is our initial state, our to-dos, that's passed to this to-dos component as a prop. And I am providing a reducer function to our useOptimistic hook that combines the current state with any new to-do that I pass to it. It basically copies that new to-do into our array of states. Now this hook is going to return our optimistic state or optimistic to-dos and a dispatcher function that I can call to optimistically change the state while the action is still pending. So that's the first step. Now the second step inside of our action, now while I'm calling this create to-do server action, I have added this part to the action. So I am creating a new to-do. So I have to create a new to-do to be able to pass it to this dispatch function to update our state. So I have a new to-do with an ID, title is completed, created at, and updated at. This is not what we're inserting in the database. This is what we are updating the state with optimistically. Still resetting the form. But before I actually call the create to-do action, which I was doing before, I call this dispatch function add optimistic to-do that's returned from useOptimistic, and I pass this new to-do to it. So this is going to say, okay, I'm hopeful that this goes through. So let's update this state as if this request was successful, show the UI to the user so it's snappy and fast while this request is processing on the server. If it goes wrong, we're going to revert back to UI, and if it goes forward okay, then everything should look the same way on the client side. And again, if there's any errors, I'm just showing a toast notification. Now down here where I was mapping over my to-dos, instead of mapping over to-dos, I'm mapping over optimistic to-dos, which is going to contain that newly added to-do. So it updates the list or the UI as soon as this form is submitted. So that's the only change that I have made over here. Now with that change, going back to the example that I showed earlier, if I just slow the network down and try to create a new to-do, learn React, let's say, this immediately updates the UI while the request is actually processing in the backend. So this is our to-dos function and how you can implement optimistic UI using this useOptimistic hook. Now let's go to the to-do item and see what we're doing there, and then we're going to also use optimistic UI there as well. So right now, while having the slow 3G and not having any optimistic UI implemented, if I go ahead and click one of these tasks as being completed, just notice that it's not going to get completed right away. So I'm going to click on this. I've already clicked on it. It doesn't show any response to the UI or update to the user, and waits for the response to go ahead and then come back with this task being completed to render a new UI, which just crosses this out. So let's see what we have so far, and then we're going to implement the useOptimistic hook. So down here, I have a list element for every task. I'm rendering this checkbox element from ShatCN, which uses Radix UI under the hood. This is going to actually render a button, not an input of type checkbox. And the reason why that matters is the way that we're going to handle the update on this checkbox. Typically on an input type checkbox, you would have an onChange property. Whereas here, because it's a custom button, we have the onChecked change event handler that we can just pass in a function to perform whatever task that we want to happen once this comes from a checked state to an unchecked or vice versa. We're going to talk about the handle change in a second, but just let's see the label here again from ShatCN, just rendering a label. And then down here, I'm just rendering this format date. Now, something cool that I figured out here, totally unrelated to Optimistic UI, it's a Tailwind trick that you can use if you're wondering how I'm doing this line throughs. So I'm marking this checkbox as a peer, so I pass in a peer class. And then for this label or that span down there, I'm saying if the peer of this label has a data property, and that's how you would target data attributes in Tailwind. So I'm saying if data attribute of type state is checked on the peer of this label, we'll turn the text into gray and draw a line through it. Now, it's important to mention that I know that this data state attribute is going to exist on this checkbox, because if you reference the Radix UI documentation, that's actually how this button works. It communicates back to the HTML with this data attributes. So you can read that data attribute and say, hey, if this data attribute is checked on the peer of this label, just put a line through this, and that's how we're implementing these things. I think this was a cool trick, so I thought I mention it here, even though it's totally unrelated to Optimistic UI. Okay, so let's go to this handle change function and see what we're doing here. Inside of the handle change, I'm calling this update to do action and passing the to do ID that I want to update and the is completed property, which comes back from this unchecked change event handler on my checkbox. So if you check it, this is going to be a Boolean of type true. I'm going to call the handle change. With that checked, this is going to go ahead and get the to-do ID because we have passed the to-do to this component. So I have the to-do.id, and then the is completed to the server action. Let's look at this server action real quickly. Here I'm taking the ID and the is completed state. I'm calling the update to do from my database access objects or functions to update a specific to do. And then I'm returning either an error if something goes wrong, or revalidating the path, whether or not this went through, to get the updated UI or the version back. Again, similar to the idea that we had here, if an error happens, well, we have eventually updated the UI optimistically by, let's say, crossing this task as completed. This task, let's say, fails here and it doesn't go through. So inside of our database, it's not marked as completed. And if you revalidate the path, it's going to refetch this to do, and it's going to revert the optimistic UI or the optimistic update that we had back to the initial state that is coming from our database. Now let's quickly also look at this update to do function. Again, this is inside of our lib folder. We looked at the get to-dos to fetch all of our to-dos, the create to-do to create a new to-do, and I have this update to do function down here, which takes in an ID and is completed and calls the Prisma client to update, where ID is this ID, and then the data is changing the is completed state. And that's how we're handling the update of every individual to-do or task using a server action. Now, I just want to bring this to your attention that we're using a server action not inside of a form or passing it to an action prop of a form, Rather, we're just using it inside of an on-click handler or an on-change handler. This is a valid use case for server actions. Actually, you can reference the documentation to see where and how or different ways that you can call your server actions from inside a use effect, from passing it to on-click handlers, and also using it together with useTransition, which we're going to do in a second here. There are different ways that you can call server actions, one of which is to just pass it to your event handlers, for example, here inside of a button. So let me comment these lines back in and see what we're doing here. So just ignore the useTransition for a second. Let's start with the useOptimistic first, and then I'm going to explain why we're using a useTransition hook. Now, useOptimistic, again, needs a state. It's the to-do that was passed to this to-do item component. And we are passing in a function. This updater function or reducer style function receives two parameters. The first one is the current state, which is the to-do. And then the second parameter is this object, which is going to be the new optimistic value. This is going to return a new state, which is our optimistic state, by spreading over to do and just updating the is completed state and the updated add date. Now this use optimistic again is going to give us the optimistic version of our to do and then an update to do dispatch function, which we can call and pass this whatever new state or new value that we wanted to merge with our state. So it's similar to use a state or use reducer in that sense, that is going to dispatch an action or a new value to this use optimistic hook, and this is going to return our new state. Down here inside of the handle change, I'm calling this update to do. This is the dispatch function. I'm getting back out of this use optimistic hook. I'm passing in the value that I wanted to merge with my state. On top of just calling our server actions, again, if there's any errors, I'm going to show the toast notification. Now, again, instead of using this to-do prop that was passed to this component, now I'm using this optimistic to-do everywhere inside of my app for the checkbox, for the label, for the format date. So therefore, my UI actually reflects based on this optimistic state rather than whatever that was coming back from the action. Now, with this in place and my network still being throttled to slow 3G, if I go ahead and cross out this learn react, this time we should see this immediately being crossed out while actually the request is in process down here in the network tab. So let's go ahead and cross this out. As you see, this just went through. Even though the request hasn't completed yet, it just completed it now. But we saw the update optimistically happen in our UI while this action was pending. Now, going back to the useTransition and why you would need to use this is you can only call this dispatch function from useOptimistic, either from inside of an action. So here in the to-dos function, inside of this action, this is where we were calling this dispatch function. But here inside of our to-do item, we don't have any action here. We're just calling this handle change, which is basically passed to an event handler. So we're not inside of an action. And anytime that you're not inside of an action, you have to wrap your dispatch function or optimistic update function inside of a transition. If you look down here, instead of just calling this handle change directly, I'm calling the start transition function, which is returned from useTransition hook. And then to this, I pass a scope or pass a function. And then inside of it, I call handle change and pass this checked, which in turn is going to call this optimistic UI update and call my server action and then do the update. Now, start transition or the useTransition hook is to just mark this state update as a transition. I'm going to have a future video about useTransition hook individually, but from a high level, it's just to mark a state update as a transition so it doesn't block the UI. This is different with the way that any other update state function works in React, where it just does that synchronously by blocking the UI. So while an update is happening, you can't go ahead and make another update. But here with the transition, this transition or the state update can be interrupted if the user actually does something else or decides to make another state update. So we're going to have a video coming up about that. But for now, just know that if you are using Optimistic UI outside of an action, you have to wrap it inside of a start transition or mark it as a transition, which you can just get back out of using this useTransition hook. And that's a wrap for this video, folks. We implemented Optimistic UI in NextJs 14 using the new useOptimistic hook in React, which is going to update the UI while an action is still pending or a request is still completing or processing. So our users are going to have a better experience, a faster feedback when interacting with our web pages and components. If you have any questions, like always, hit me up in the comments and I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.